Kerry's visit to Afghanistan. We are now joined by Volker. He is the executive director of the McCain Institute for International Leadership at Arizona State University. He's also a former U.S. ambassador to NATO. Secretary Kerry gets to Afghanistan. He meets with the UN Special Envoy of Afghanistan, President Karzai. Doesn't meet with either of these candidates first. He meets with those two. What's the significance of that?
Well, he's trying to show that we're keeping Afghanistan together as a country. Karzai is still the president. Neither of these guys has actually won the election yet. The UN is interested in engaging Afghanistan as a country and keeping it together. So there's a little bit of symbolism in the timing of the meetings, how you go through that. And I think he's doing the right things by trying to get these guys to work together and work through a legal process to evaluate electoral fraud and then look at what the legitimate results would be and then accept legitimate results. Anything other than that, where one side or the other, just blasts out and says, we're it, risks dividing the country and risks really giving an opening to the Taliban.
And we'll get to that in just a minute, but one analyst said the biggest part of this job is making his way through the fog of mistrust on both sides, which I think is interesting. Abdullah, actually, I would think has even more mistrust because he's been here before. In 2009, he accused the voter fraud. He ran against Karzai. Here he is a second time around, undoubtedly not really happy with the results. How do you kind of cut through the fog of mistrust? How do you come up with an equitable finding for both sides when both are going to be going at it saying, hey?
Well, that's the tough job that John Kerry is looking at right now, is how do you find a way to keep them working together for the good of the country instead of separately for the good of their ethnic or tribal affiliations? What's behind this, it's not just the two guys. They probably could get along. But behind them, you have the Pashtun community and Karzai that has lined up with Ghani. You have the Tajiks and the northern tribes that have lined up with Abdullah. And he just can't let them down. He's got to be representing those interests. I think what you're going to have to do is rerun some of the vote. They're going to have to document where the voter fraud was, how large it was, assess the impact on the election, rerun some of this to try to create credibility in the eyes of those communities, so that it's going to show that, okay, what now has resulted from this is a more credible outcome.
You mentioned this group. You could change the names to Sunnis, to Shias, and suddenly it's Iraq. I mean, could that happen here where Afghanistan looks a lot like Iraq?
Yeah, a couple things with Iraq that are really significant is that we pulled the U.S. forces out at a time when it was relatively stable, and it wasn't long before these communities then started pushing their own interests at each other's expense, redivided the country, and now we see an outright civil war and an Iraq divided into three pieces. That is very possible if we get out of Afghanistan only on the timetable instead of on the situation on the ground. And it's also possible if we don't leave behind a government that's working that is inclusive. That's why this is really critical right now to put these pieces together. And if they don't work, we should be very seriously considering changing our own timelines.
We're out of time, but undoubtedly the other issue, the Taliban, which they could be creating some mischief as well.
And they are in Helmand province already.
Yeah. Kurt, thanks so much. Always a pleasure seeing you. Thanks for coming in.